CJ, it's going to appear on the side.
Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome those of you here at the Parish Center at St. X Church, downtown Cincinnati, and those of you out there live streaming. Tonight's presentation in our Embracing God's Creation series is a presentation by Sister of Charity C.J. Willie, and it's entitled Listening and Responding to the Cry of the Earth and the Cry of the Poor. I'm Jim Brown. My wife and I are members of Bellarmine Chapel. I'm also connected to the Jesuit Spiritual Center in Milford, and I'm on a member of the planning team that has put together this series that we started back in September. This series, Embracing God's Creation, is a collaborative effort of the Cincinnati Jesuit family, including Bellarmine Chapel, St. X Church, Xavier University's Institute for Spirituality and Social Justice, St. Xavier High School, the Jesuit Spiritual Center at Milford, and the newly formed Xavier Jesuit Academy in Bond Hill. The series is grounded in both Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si on care for our common home and the Global Society of Jesus 2019 Universal Apostolic Preference Number 4, Caring for Our Common Home, which establishes this as a priority for all the Jesuit works over the next decade. The hope is that by exploring the ecological spirituality of Laudato Si, together as a Jesuit family, we can foster not only individual and institutional transformation, but wider transformation in our church. As you listen today, we invite you to experience an ecological conversion, an awakening to the many ways God is active in our world, caring for creation, and loving each of us as part of creation. The series itself will involve presentations like this one, family-friendly immersions, and prayer experiences. We hope that this variety of offerings will invite each member of our communities to engage some part of the series over this year. Again, thank you for being here and participating. Our format is simply this. We will begin with an opening prayer, and then Sister CJ will present till about 8 o'clock, and then we'll break into small groups, and then we'll have at the end of the evening time for questions and comments. For those of you watching on the live stream, we will invite you to log into the Zoom link for the small group discussion as well. That link was emailed and is available beneath the YouTube video in the live stream's description and will be put into the chat bar. I'd like to introduce Sister CJ. She is a Sister of Charity of Cincinnati. She holds a Bachelor of Arts in Sociology, a Master's degree in Reading, and a PhD in Multicultural Education. She has extensive experience working with multiple cultures internationally as a teacher trainer, cultural diversity consultant, and retreat director. She is a frequent speaker at local, regional, national, and international conferences. She served 2 terms of office as the NGO representative at the United Nations for the Sisters of Charity Foundation. She currently serves, and she continues to work with microfinancing projects in Africa. She currently serves as the program director for Earth Connection, an environmental center in Cincinnati, Ohio, out in Delhi, and does freelance work in educational and retreat settings. And so we will begin with our prayer service. St. Francis of Assisi reminds us that our common home is like a sister with whom we share our life and a beautiful mother who opens her arms to embrace us. This sister now cries out to us because of the harm we have inflicted on her by our irresponsible use and abuse of the goods with which God has endowed her. St. Francis invites us to see nature as a magnificent book in which God speaks to us and grants us a glimpse of his infinite beauty and goodness. Both everyday experience and scientific research show that the gravest effects of all attacks on the environment are suffered by the poorest. Each creature possesses its own particular goodness and perfection. Each reflects in its own way a ray of God's infinite wisdom and goodness. Soil, water, mountains, everything is, as it were, a caress of God. God has written a precious book whose letters are the multitude of created things present in the universe. From panoramic vistas to the tiniest living form, nature is a constant source of wonder and awe. It is also a continuing revelation of the divine. Nature is God's art. Everything is related, and we human beings are united as brothers and sisters on a wonderful pilgrimage, woven together by the love God has for each of his creatures, and which also unites us in fond affection with Brother Sun, Sister Moon, Brother River, and Mother Earth. Interdependence obliges us to think of one world with a common plan. All Christian communities have an important role to play in ecological education. Inner peace is closely related to care for ecology and for the common good. It is reflected in a balanced lifestyle together with the capacity for wonder, which takes us to a deeper understanding of life. An integral ecology includes taking time to recover a serene harmony with nature. We need an attitude of heart which accepts each moment as a gift from God to be lived to the full. Care for nature is part of a lifestyle which includes the capacity for living together and communion. The universe unfolds in God, who fills it completely. There is a mystical meaning to be found in a leaf, in a mountain trail, in a dewdrop, in a poor person's face. Everything is interconnected, and this invites us to develop a spirituality of that global solidarity which flows from the mystery of the Trinity. Amen. I just want to add one more thing. Come on up, sister. That many, if not all, of the pictures in the presentation and the prayer service were taken by Sister CJ, who is also a photographer.
Just a
Welcome.
hobby. Well, it's a pleasure to be here with all of you this evening and to present on one of my favorite topics, which is always Laudato Si. And particularly tonight to look at the care for the earth and the care of the poor. Okay? And so I'm going to start a little bit differently than I usually start Laudato Si presentations, but I think it's important in view of the fact that we're trying to look at how integral ecology works. And Thomas Berry tells us that it's all a question of story right now. We're kind of in between stories. The great story, the story that we grew up with, doesn't work anymore. But we don't have a new story yet. And that's why we find ourselves in such chaos. But scientists tell us that chaos is absolutely the precedent of creativity. So hopefully we're going to see that creativity shortly. Okay, so what our cosmology tells us is what's important to us. So when we wake up in the morning, we know what's expected of us, okay? But now everything that we thought was one way is suddenly not working anymore. And that's why Thomas Berry says we're in between stories. He says our traditional story is no longer functioning properly, and we have yet to learn the new story. And Charles Eisenstein says to us, there is a vast territory between what we're trying to leave behind and where we want to go, and we don't have any maps for the territory. Okay? So, again, what is a cosmology? Well, it's what the story tells us to believe, the culture we've grown up in. What is important? What is not important? What is right? What is not right? What is acceptable? What is unacceptable? All of that is part of a cosmology. And that's where today we find ourselves in a very difficult position because we're just not sure. Okay? We all grew up with a Bible cosmology. Okay? And we grew up with knowing that creation, even though we didn't really think 7 days was exactly 7 days, we did grow up with the idea that there were 7 different epochs of creation. So the first day was light, the second was the vault expanding across the sky, the third was dry land, vegetation, and seeds. The fourth was stars, sun, and moon. The fifth were birds, fish, sea creatures. The sixth, animals, man, and woman. And on the seventh day, God rested. But there are some problems with that story today. It's not that the story was wrong. People were operating out of a cosmology several thousand years ago. Okay? But today we know that that's a static model of creation. And science is telling us creation is not static, it's ongoing. Okay? There is really no developmental dimension to that story. Creation is a one-time event. Okay? There's no relatedness between the elements. Each creation is separate from each other. Okay? The earth is seen as a resource for humans and to be used however we want it. Okay? It is a strongly patriarchal story. Okay? And it is a derivative of man and blame for this failure. Woman is. But we still believe that the creation story is a divine revelation. It doesn't make it wrong because it doesn't serve today's needs. People then simply didn't know what we know today. So that's why we need a new story. And so Dwayne Elgin says to us, I do not believe that the human community can come to a new relationship with one another and the earth unless we also come to a new relationship with the universe. Life-changing consequences flow from this new perspective. And so now we have not only what the Hubble telescope has sent back, what the Webb telescope is sending back. And it's incredible. Okay? This is one of my favorite pictures coming back from the Webb telescope. And it's showing us that the universe is alive, and it's ongoing, and it's continuing. And so we're getting these incredible visuals. And Pope Francis says, Big Bang is fine. We just know that God started the Big Bang. It doesn't change our idea of who created the world. Okay? So today there is no shared understanding about how humans relate to the cosmos, and in particular to planet Earth, our home. Okay? The cosmic story arising from a literal understanding of the Bible has ceased to make sense in our cultural milieu today. And so these authors say to us, ours is probably the first culture in human history that has no cosmology, no common story. Okay? But now we have Pope Francis coming with Laudato Si, and he gets the big picture. I remember before he released Laudato Si, there were many politicians who were already criticizing it. They had no idea what was in it, but they said he had no right to write an encyclical on the environment. He's not a scientist. Joke was on them. He is a scientist. Okay? And so he gets it. He understands that there's no distinction between believing in a God who created it all, whether he did so in 7 days or over 1,000,000 years, it doesn't matter. Okay? And Laudato Si flows out of that. Okay? The three cosmic principles we talk about in the universe story are diversity, interiority, and communion. And that's what Laudato Si flows out of. In 1,000,000 different ways, he talks about that. He reminds us 14 times in the encyclical that everything is connected. We can't separate things. Okay? And he talks about an integral ecology. He says, since everything is closely interrelated and today's problems call for a vision capable of taking into account every aspect of the global crisis, I suggest that we now consider some elements of an integral ecology, one which clearly respects its human and social dimensions. And so just so you remember what integral ecology is, I have a little video.
Yo, listen up. This is your home. It's the only one you got. This place is pretty, but you can't live there. You can't even get there. Sorry, Pete. This is your home. It's the only one you got. Cherish it, protect it. It's the only one you're gonna get. These guys, they're your neighbors. They ain't going away. They ain't leaving. You have to get along with them. So you have to learn to share. You have to get along. You have to learn to get along because they are your neighbors. They're not going away. Okay, all this stuff, the animals, the waters, the sky, the ground, the bugs, the fish, the tacos, the people, they're all connected. Everything is connected. They all depend on one another. If you ignore that, you're doomed. Keep doomed, okay? So listen up. It's all one. Not two worlds, not three, one. Just one. So get it in gear. Remember, all is one, okay? Hit it.
Okay, you got integral ecology now? It's the best video I could find to explain integral ecology. All right, so as we look at the cry of the earth, we know that it's a call to protect our common home for the well-being of all, as we equitably address the climate crisis, biodiversity loss, and ecological sustainability. And sometimes there's some confusion between the words equity and equality. They are not the same thing. Equality means everybody gets the same thing. Equity means each person gets what they need. Okay? So one of the cartoons that's frequently used with that is 3 young men about this size, and this size, wanting to see a baseball game. Okay, so there's a high fence there. The older one can see over. So they give each one of them the same size box. So now the older one can see over really well. The middle one can see over, but the little one is standing on his box and he still can't see over. Okay, equity is giving that little one 2 boxes because he needs that to be able to see over. And that's an important distinction. Okay. So, biodiversity loss, right now in Egypt, we have the COP27, which is the Conference of the Parties. And that is held every year. It came out of the 1992, actually, the World Conference on Sustainability that was held in Rio de Janeiro. In 2012, there was a Rio Plus 20 conference, which I was able to attend. And at that, we had world leaders from most of the countries in the world had high-level representatives there, if not their prime minister or president. And we sat and we listened to every single one of them say, we are at a critical moment in Earth's history. But basically, you do something, not me. Out of that, however, came the Sustainable Development Goals. But at the same time that conference was going on in the big fancy place that they had in Rio, there was another conference going on the other side of town, which was really much more interesting. And it was all the indigenous people from throughout South America. And they were there to tell us what was happening to their homes. Now, as I mentioned, the Sustainable Development Goals did come out of the conference. When I say Millennium Development Goals, how many people here know what I'm talking about? One in the back of the room. That's pretty typical in the United States. When I was speaking in India, every school child knew what the Millennium Development Goals were. Okay, they were printed in every Catholic church. Okay, the whole country was aware of them. They were 8 goals that came about as a result of the new millennium. Okay? Basically, they were written by a few men in a back room somewhere. 7 of the goals pertained to the poor countries themselves and said that they were responsible for getting out of their poverty. Only one of those goals was that the rich countries had to help. So they were from 20 to 2015, with the goal being that poverty would be reduced by 1/2 by the year 2015. Obviously, that did not happen. So in 2015, outgrowing the 2012 Sustainability Conference, they designed the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, what was different about those, there were 2 phrases I learned at the UN I will never forget, and it was from the smaller countries. One was, okay, no decision about us without us. And the second was, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. Okay? And so they insisted that if there were going to be another set of goals, they were going to participate in the writing of them. So at the time I was still at the UN, and we went to meeting after meeting. The goal was that they would be few in number and enforceable. Well, at the first meeting, we came up with 78, which was not going to work. They finally got them down to 17, okay? And basically, it put the onus on both the developing and the developed countries, so that there was a shared responsibility there. Okay? And one of the big things was biodiversity and the loss of biodiversity. And so we see it in a number of areas. We see it with habitat loss. We see it with invasive species. We see it with overexploitation, pollution, and climate change associated with global warming. And of course, in the beginning, we talked a lot about global warming, and today we talk a lot about climate change. But we need to understand that climate change is precipitated by global warming. But the terminology was changed because there are so many different effects of climate change. So we have the melting permafrost, we have the rising sea levels, we have stronger storms. All of that is a part of climate change. So this is an example of what's happening with biodiversity in some places. This is the Canadian tar sands. Okay, so they're getting oil out of that. And so the whole indigenous area there is pretty much destroyed. I met a young woman several years ago at an indigenous conference who was talking about that was her homeland. And that was what was left when they were finished. Okay, the Brazilian Amazon. Most of you in here know Sister Dorothy Stang and the work that she was doing. Am I correct in assuming you all know who that is? Okay, this is a pretty with-it parish, I know. Okay. And, you know, she was working with the people in the areas with indigenous people throughout Brazil, and was killed for the work that she was doing by the wealthy landowners, okay? But this is what is happening. You know, some commentators are saying it's like the size of a football field every 5 minutes disappearing. Okay? And we call the Amazon region the lungs of the earth. So it really is absolutely critical that they be saved. And there was a side event the other day in COP27 where Brazil and Indonesia and I think it was the Democratic Republic of the Congo signed an agreement to preserve their rainforests. Okay, this is Ghana, and I was there right before the pandemic, and the bishop was taking me around and showing me this is what it looked like after the Chinese finished taking all the gold out. And there was tons and tons of gold. Just tons of it. Did the people ever see any of it? Not one little bit. And he was really, trying to work with the government. And you have to acknowledge that their government is responsible for some of that as well. When I was there were all kinds of bulldozers lined up along the side of one of the roads, and we're talking dirt roads here. But there were like 50 bulldozers. And we were saying, well, what are those bulldozers from? Well, those are from the Chinese. And they had come in, again, after they'd gotten thrown out. They had come back and were trying to take out more gold. And the government discovered that they were doing that. And so they threw them out of the country and kept all their bulldozers. But the people there were saying the government had to have let them in. They didn't just come in with 100 bulldozers and nobody knew about it. But it was the outcry from the people that got them thrown out of the country. Okay, and so what Francis tells us is at the root of the ecological crisis, there is, in fact, a profound moral and cultural crisis affecting our societies, characterized by an exaggerated individualistic anthropocentrism that has led, among other factors, to altering the relationship between human beings and nature, with consequences now apparent to all. One of my favorite conferences at the UN was a 2-week seminar called the Forum on the Rights of the Indigenous. And it involved indigenous peoples from around the world. It was by far the most colorful of the conferences because they all came in native dress. But each year they would say to the rest of us who were there, you keep talking about the environment. You keep talking about how important it is to preserve the environment, but you're not talking to us. And we've been doing it for thousands of years. And I think one of the things that we're seeing today that I am really appreciating is the number of books that are coming out written by indigenous peoples. Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, Sacred Instructions by Sherry Mitchell. There's another one by Douglas Feathers. And all of these are talking about how to preserve the environment and how they have been doing it for thousands of years from their point of view. And that is very hopeful, I think, that we are seeing that. Okay? He also says, we have gone ahead at breakneck speed, feeling powerful and able to do anything. Greedy for profit, we let ourselves get caught up in things and lured away by haste. We were not shaken awake by wars or injustice across the world, nor did we listen to the cry of the poor or of our ailing planet. We carried on regardless, thinking we would stay healthy in a world that was sick. And one of the things about Laudato Si that I certainly have appreciated is the simplicity of its language. It's very readable. If you try to read earlier encyclicals by John Paul II or Benedict, they were scholars, very erudite, and they didn't appeal to the average person, whereas this encyclical certainly has. Every year there's a celebration for World Interfaith Harmony Week. And again, in the United States, we don't even know there is a World Interfaith Harmony Week, but it's the first week of February, and many countries really celebrate that. The president of Jordan is the one who brought that up before the General Assembly about maybe 10 years ago now. And we voted for it. As a country, we said, yes, that's a really good idea. But then we don't tell people what we have voted for. Nor did we tell them that we voted for the Sustainable Development Goals. But one of the things that came out of that was people starting to look at how they might work together on sustainability issues. That it didn't just have to be like just Catholics working on it, but others could as well. And at one of those yearly celebrations, the rabbi, the Baha'i person, and the Hindu person all talked about Francis and the encyclical. okay? Because they had all read it. Here in Cincinnati, we now have a group called Faith Communities Go Green, and Lori knows it because she's worked with us on that. And the idea was to bring together faith communities around environmental issues. And we had done that at the UN as well. We had an interfaith committee. And we realized that when we came together around the issue of environment, we weren't worried about doctrine. We were all worried about this common home that we have and how can we protect it together. Okay? And so that's one of the things that we're being challenged to do. Okay? So our contemporary ecological crisis, we have forgotten that the world is impregnated with the divine presence. Now think about that for a moment. The pictures we just saw from the Webb telescope, I mean, there's obviously an intelligence there. Someone who appreciates beauty. Okay? We have used and abused it with little thought of the damages that we're causing or are causing. Okay, we just seem to think that we can keep going on and on and on, using resources with no consequences. Not going to happen. We've forgotten that this is our common home. Okay? And what we did is we reduced the physical world to a mere storehouse of resources for human consumption. It's just real estate for market speculation. Okay? We've forgotten that the universe is the first book of God's creation. And do you know who said that first? Anybody want to take a guess? Thomas Aquinas. He's the one who said it first. Long, long time ago. Okay? Even before any sacred text was written, God was revealing God's self through the unfolding universe. Creation is an ongoing process. God's revelation through creation is dynamic. And it's so exciting to look at those visuals coming back to us that are looking back 13.8 billion years and showing us a universe which has never stopped evolving, that God is continually creating. And Revelation isn't finished. Okay, it is ongoing. I like to think of God as the divine artist. There's a wonderful children's book called The Dreamer, and it's one of my favorite stories of creation because it pictures God as an artist. And he picks up some scissors and he cuts out a star. And he's very pleased with the star that he has cut out. And he makes more and more and more. And he gets so excited with what he's creating that he starts on trees and birds and ultimately people. But you can just see in the pages of that book and in the gorgeous illustrations, that that's how creation is ongoing. There's a God there who continues to create. Okay? And Francis reminds us that in the face of the emergencies of human-induced climate change, social exclusion, and extreme poverty, we join together to declare that human-induced climate change is a scientific reality, and its decisive mitigation is a moral and religious imperative for humanity. It's a moral issue. Okay? And that's a really important point. There's a whole new initiative on the part of the United Nations. It's a document that was published about 6 months ago between the United Nations Development Program or Environmental Program and the World Parliament of Religions. And it's called Faith for Earth, A Call for Action. It's 184 pages, fully downloadable. But the whole purpose of the book is to bring the moral voice to the climate change debate. And that's what they're saying. That is what is missing. We're looking at this from an economic point of view. We're looking at it from a political point of view. It needs to be looked at from a moral point of view. Okay? So today we have to realize that a true ecological approach always becomes a social approach. And all of these quotes are directly from Francis. It must integrate questions of justice in debates on the environment so as to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. And so we look at the cry of the poor, a call to promote eco-justice, aware that we are called to defend life from conception to death and all forms of life on earth. Okay? So, concern for the environment thus needs to be joined to a sincere love for our fellow human beings and an unwavering commitment to resolving the problems of society. And he reminds us that St. Francis shows us how to do this, that Francis showed the inseparable bond between concern for nature, justice, commitment to society, and interior peace. One of the other things that he did in Laudato Si was he didn't just sit down and write this himself. He asked for input from people from multiple religious traditions, as well as took bishops' documents from around the world and incorporated what they were saying in the document as well. And so it was the Bolivian bishops who said, both everyday experience and scientific research show that the gravest effects of all attacks on the environment are suffered by the poorest. And he says, there's been a tragic rise in the number of people attempting to flee from their homes because their homes are disappearing. And my first encounter with that was from the Prime Minister of Tuvalu. He stood up at a General Assembly meeting and he said, is there a country here who will take our people? Because our country is disappearing. You're talking about small islands in the South Pacific. And then the question became, what do you call a people who no longer have a country? Okay. And so I want to give you some on-the-ground experiences. Tuvalu was one, Kiribati is another, and maybe some of you even know this gentleman. He was a former Peace Corps volunteer on the island of Kiribati in the South Pacific. And you can see how tiny the island is. Okay, it's composed of a number of different islands. We bonded right away because I was also a Peace Corps volunteer on an island. So we talked a lot about what's the difference between those islands and what's happening there today. But he's dedicated the whole rest of his life to caring about those people. So he has worked in Hollywood on 2 documentaries. This was one called A Note's Ark. And the idea, this was the Prime Minister, equivalent to President of Kiribati, talking about what was happening in his country. And when you hear it from the people's point of view, it touches something in you because there's a human connection there. Okay? This was Ambassador Abdul, Mohammed, and I was on a panel with him at the UN, and he was talking about his country. It's like 200 islands, 315,000 people, and it has the lowest elevation in the entire world. It's also a super tourist spot because it has absolutely magnificent fish, coral, etc. But he said they put a seawall around the capital, Malé, okay, but there really wasn't any way they could put it around 200 islands. And so what's happening is as the sea level is rising, it is destroying the natural habitat that drew tourists. So that cuts off their whole economic point of view. Okay. So beaches are eroding, coral reefs and marine life are undermined, they're threatening the livelihood of the people. Rise in climate-related illnesses such as dengue fever. Okay, now I was in an island in the Caribbean which was very different from the islands there. They also are discovering that they have to make some major changes in their lifestyle because of what's happening. But it's not happening quite as rapidly there as it is in the South Pacific. And so the island I was on, the gentleman who was the prime minister or the ambassador from that island happened to be a teacher I used to teach with. So we talked often about what is happening on the island. And the island I was on was St. Lucia, which of course, if you watch Wheel of Fortune, they're always sending people there because it's such a beautiful spot. But I assure you, for the people who live there, they don't go to Sandals. Okay? It's quite a different reality for them. Okay? But what he was saying is, we recognize that we have to find more water-resistant crops. We have to move the towns and villages away from the coastline. He said, but that means up the mountains. And that takes a different type of architecture, and that takes money. And he says, we don't have that. So one of the big sticking points right now at COP27 is the smaller countries pretty much screaming and yelling at the larger countries saying, you've caused this, now help us. And kicking and screaming, the big countries are like, well, you know, maybe we can give them a little something. But they need some real help real fast. Okay, so what the Prime Minister said is, you know, you all talk about, you know, how many centimeters or how many inches of sea level rise there is, and you do all these scientific studies. He said, but you're not looking at the human factor. You're not looking at the people who are being affected by all of this, who are losing their livelihood, who are losing their countries. You have to consider that as well, okay? This is a picture that I took in Tanzania a couple of years ago, and this was the drought there. And I think one of the saddest scenes I have ever seen in my life was this one. I did not take these pictures. These are pictures similar to what I saw, but I could not intrude on the people who were experiencing the hardships they were. This is a Maasai warrior, and for the Maasai people, the cow is the center of their lives. It truly is. I had a Kenyan friend who was not Maasai, but married a Maasai, and she said early in the morning they go out with their cows and they come home at night with their cow. And that's pretty much their whole life. Okay? And while we were going through Maasai territory, I saw some people, some of the warriors with their cow, and it was just one cow in this case, and they were trying to push it up a hillside, and it fell over and died. And the look on those people's faces, I will never forget. Their whole reality changed in that moment. How are they going to support their family? How are they going to educate their children? Okay, it was all there in the tears that you could see on their faces. Okay? And this is not the only place that it's happening. There are many places in Africa that are experiencing severe droughts. Okay? I like the fact that scientists are saying that what Laudato Si really does is illustrates that Pope Francis understands systemic change. He's a systems thinker. Okay? It's not just putting Band-Aids on something. It's that you have to change the systems that are causing the problems. And so he says here, he's challenging us to move from seeing the world as a machine to understanding it as a network. Everything is connected. And he invites us to think in terms of connectedness, relationships, patterns, and contexts. Okay? He reminds us that ethical behavior is always related to community. It is always behavior for the common good. Okay? So he's saying here, he's urgently appealing that all people be present at the table who are concerned, who are going to be affected by the decisions that are being made. And we know even in our own country, the systemic racism that has taken place in so many areas. You know, where do we build garbage dumps? Where did we put the highways through where we split cities in half and totally destroyed communities? So he's saying here, everybody has to be at the table, remember? No decision about us without us, and if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. Okay, and he says the local people should have a special place at the table. we don't always understand the problems from the local people's point of view. I'll give you a really clear example of that. I worked with the Diocese of Orlando for a number of years in their mission office, and we had a sister diocese in the Dominican Republic. And when they first started, this was long before I got there, but I probably would have made the same mistake. But they went down and they were going to work with this one village, so they went down to assess the situation, but they didn't really talk to the people. They kind of decided what they needed. And so they had decided that what they needed was better educational opportunities. So they came back to Orlando and they developed this wonderful educational program, and they went down and presented it, and they said, no thank you. Of what value is it for us to have a better education program if our children are too sick to go to school? What we need is clean water. So you always have to work with people where they are. I want to show you a few examples of some of this. I serve on the board of an organization called Microfinancing Partners in Africa. And it was founded by a precious blood sister who is a friend of mine. When she was 55, about 15 years ago, she decided she was taking a sabbatical. So she asked her community if she could go to Africa. She's the precious blood sister from O'Fallon, Missouri. And her community said, we don't have anybody in Africa. She says, I know, but I just really want to go to Africa. They said, fine, find a trip and go. So she found the cheapest trip she could. 7 months in an old school bus with 21 Australian college students, sleeping out in a pub tent every single night. They went through 22 African countries. They went from Egypt down to South Africa. And in the process, each night the people in the villages would come to talk with them. Now, obviously they all spoke indigenous languages, but on the eastern side of the country you have many English-speaking people as well. And when she came back to the States, she thought, I have to do something about that. So she learned about microfinancing, and she worked with a woman who was already doing it. She says, I can't start new projects from here over there. But she met a woman named Ingrid who was Swedish, whose husband was Canadian. They had adopted 3 Kenyan children from the streets. They didn't even know who the parents were. And what she did is, during the weekends, her children wanted to go back down to visit with their friends on the streets. And when you walk on those streets, it's mostly by the river. People are just laying everywhere, and everybody's sniffing glue because it kind of takes away the hunger. Well, she challenged, the women said to her, well, what are you going to do for us? And she said, well, what are you going to do for yourselves? And she challenged them to save money. She's talking to street people lying on the ground, and she's telling them to save money. So after about 6 months, they saved about $1 a piece. And that was the beginning of her microfinancing project, which she called Jemmy Bora. I was there for the 10th anniversary celebration, and she went from those 50 street beggars to 300,000 borrowers throughout the country. Okay? And what she always did with people is say, what can you do? And then she helped them to get started. Okay, so I just want to show you a couple pictures of some of that. This is where they live. This is the Kibera and Mathare Valley slums. And when you talk about social distancing, Kibera is 1.5 million people in 1 square mile. Okay, that's how people live. Okay, and this is Ingrid. And people absolutely adore her. She's called Mama Ingrid everywhere. But she will not give a handout to anyone. They have to work for it. She says people have the right, the will, and the capacity to direct their own future. Okay? And so what she does is, like this lady here, Sister Tony is the one in the center there. We were visiting some of the people that she had, were in her microfinancing project. This is a very simple one, okay? This woman has a little shop now in the marketplace, but she can now afford to send her children to school. She got a loan to be able to buy some products. And once they borrow, as soon as they return, they can borrow twice as much. And the return rate is 98%. Okay, Marie had a little fruit stand in her backyard, so she didn't sell a whole lot of fruit from her backyard. But She's now got a fruit stand on the main street. And it's changed her life. Now, Joyce was pretty exceptional. Joyce lost her husband and several of her sons in the warfare in the northern part of the country. There's a lot of warfare among the tribes over water because there's such drought up there. And when Ingrid asked her, what can you do? She said, well, I can cook really well. So she got a little stand on the side of the road. Now she owns a restaurant and employs 21 people. Okay. A different project that we work with, which is also an example of systemic change, okay, is in Masaka, Uganda. And the bishop in the center there is just a remarkable man. A priest from his diocese was studying at St. Louis University, where Sister Tony, she lives in St. Louis. He heard about her and he came to her and he said, would you help my bishop? And her first response was, I don't do bishops. And he came back several times and he said, well, finally come and meet my bishop. And he really is an exceptional human being. He unfortunately died last year, but the project goes on. And he had met with the people to ask, what will help you get out of poverty? He said, I can't meet their spiritual needs when they're all hungry. So we have to start there. And they said a cow. So much like Heifer International, he started with a cow. And these are people I've met along the way. Peter and Josephine received one of the very first cows that he had. Okay, so when I got there, it was about 8 years after they had gotten their cow. So they were pretty well established. But they were showing us that the requirement for getting a cow, you have to work for 9 to 12 months before you get it. You have to raise the grasses for it. You have to build the stable for it. There's their happy cow. Okay, then he realized that there's no electricity in any of these areas. So we worked with an engineer, and now they use the feces of the cow for biogas. So Peter is showing us how this works. It's got like 3 parts to it. So this is part 1, where you put the feces to start with. You push it down that hole there. It goes into that second part, which is the digester, and that separates the methane from the waste product. The methane goes into the house, so now she has a stove in the house, and lighting, and the waste product goes out to the garden. Okay? And they now have about, last time I was there, they had about 1,500 chickens. Okay? And this is her stove she was so proud of, she wanted to cook a meal for us. Okay? And Peter went out to get the coffee beans, the lighting in their house. And they have put 7 children through the university from the 1 cow. The value of the cow is $800, but they have to return that. And when the cow is given to them, it is already pregnant. And I learned that you can make the baby cow a girl or a boy, whichever you want. You actually can help to determine the sex by the insemination. Okay? And so we wanted female cows, so they have a whole development program at the diocese to do all of this. One of their sons was just recently ordained a priest for the diocese there. Okay, the second home we went to was a Muslim home. And again, he's showing us around everything. The bishop says you have to have personal cleanliness, so you have to have a latrine. And we noticed that in every latrine we saw, it's just a hole in the ground, there's no fixture in there. But in every one we saw, there was a stick in the back. And we said, well, what's that for? They said, that's for the snakes. This is his little tippy tap, and he's burning bricks. He's doing bricks making in the front of his house so he can build a brick house instead of a mud house. And that's their stable, and all of their children are now in school. Okay, then he realized that these cows were giving lots and lots of milk, like 18 to 20 liters a day, and no family needed that. So he started a dairy. And he set up collection stations all over the diocese. And he had the young men in town trained how to build the biogas system, so it kept them out of trouble and it gave them work. Okay? And so now they have a really growing concern. They have a steady income, and they now provide milk for the entire city. Okay? So because of a cow, it changed multiple people's lives. Okay? So where do we go from here? We all like being in our comfort zone. in that center there, okay? But outside of our comfort zone is our grace margin. And that's where God is continually calling us, always urging us to move out of our comfort zone. What we don't want to do is push people into their fear zone, because when we do that, it paralyzes them. And that's where we find a large portion of the population today is just paralyzed, not knowing what to do because the problems are so overwhelming. So if we talk about moving out of our comfort zone and recognizing that God calls each of us differently, okay, and not try to compete with the person next door, where is God calling you? So we are called today to listen to the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, and to reflect on the ways we can change our lifestyles, consumption, and production patterns. To be unafraid to question the sacred cows in our culture: individualism, capitalism, consumerism, competition. We just accept these as part of the culture. Are they really all that good? They're not all that bad either, but we have to question. You can't have an economy that needs to continually grow on a planet that is finite. We have to redefine our idea of progress, and we have to participate in educational opportunities that strive to promote a new way of thinking about human beings, life, society, and our relationship with nature. And we have to recognize that we are part of a global community, that we share a common home with all of God's creatures. So where is God calling you? And I'd like to leave you with a very short story. It's a Native American tale. And it says, a long time ago, before anybody can remember, people actually lived in harmony with their environment and with each other. But gradually they separated themselves from the oneness that they knew. And the elders of the tribe became greatly concerned because they knew what a gift it was from the Great Spirit to live in harmony with each other and with the earth. So they gathered in council and decided to gather up that wisdom until such a time as the people were ready for it. So they gathered it up and then met in council to talk about where will we hide it until the people are ready. Someone said, I know a cave that has so many caverns, no one's ever been to the back of them. Maybe we can hide it there. Someone else said, these people are sneaky and they go where they don't belong. And surely one of them will take it and find it before it's time. So they reflected again, and someone else said, I know a lake that's so deep no one's ever reached the bottom of it. Maybe we can put it there. And at first they thought they had their answer, but then someone said, these people like to fish, and surely one of them will hook it and bring it up before it's time. Now the elders were becoming greatly concerned because they felt so keenly the responsibility to safeguard the wisdom that the Great Spirit had given them, but they didn't know where to hide it until the eldest woman of the tribe spoke up and said, let's hide it inside of them. They'll never think to look there. And they all knew they had their answer. And so the answers aren't out there. The answers are in each and every one of us. Okay? And that's those three dimensions of the universe story. Okay? Differentiation. We are different and unique with wonderful gifts. Interiority. We have to look within ourselves, because only there will we find the way to communion. Thank you.
CJ, thank you. Now, we'd like to take about 15 minutes to reflect on what you've heard and the impact it's had. There's a copy of the reflection questions at your chair. And if you're watching on the live stream, now's the time to join the Zoom room with Tim Severin. The link is available in the YouTube video description and chat. And I will alert you when there's about a minute left, and then we'll come back, or we'll have some time for some feedback and some questions for CJ. So I invite you here to maybe get in groups of 3 or and if possible, with people you don't know, if that's possible. So, go. Thank you. So does anyone here have a reflection or a question for Sister CJ? I do, if nobody has one. Yes, right here.
I mean, from your talks, it talks about the disparities of the environment and the disparities of the poor. So, as an individual, going into face the disparities of the environment and the poor, what role does faith play? And how is faith turned into kind of paced actions? Because everything isn't done at once, and as you said, it's a continual creative process, so it's almost never done.
And that's true, it's never done.
Can you repeat that?
Okay. Now let me think of it. See if
Where
I
the
can-
where faith fits.
Yeah, where does faith enter into all of this? Well, all of the people we were working with in all of these places are faith-filled people. And doctrine isn't all that important to them, but faith in God is. And their support for each other is, and that's really critical. That's an element, we've tried, people have tried microfinancing in the United States and it doesn't work. Because the way that it works most effectively is, like in the Kenyan project, we take like maybe this small group here, okay, although Mohammed Yunus says don't give money to the men. He says only give it to the women because they put it back in their communities. And the men spend it at the rum shop, trying to show off for their friends. Now that's not true of all men, I know that. Okay. But let's say this group here is group number one, okay? They have to decide among themselves who is going to be the first one to get a loan. And invariably, when I have sat with some of those groups, they always choose the one who needs it the most. Always. And then the second person doesn't get a loan until the first loan is returned, which really encourages, they all encourage that person and help her to return it. When they try it in the States, they've tried it with small groups. First one gets the loan and that's it. They don't return the money. There isn't the bondedness there that these people have among themselves. So you need a different kind of way of doing that. I think faith is very important to the people.
Well, it sounds like they also have faith in each other.
Very much so. And I've discovered that I've worked most of my ministerial life in inner city neighborhoods or foreign countries. And I always have found that their support of each other is so much greater than you find in more wealthy communities. It's like in the wealthier communities, we don't have that need.
Yeah.
But you know what? We do.
Yeah.
We just don't recognize that we do. And that's why those sacred cows I talked about, like competition. We have to look at that. Is that really the way we want to go? Does everything have to be competitive all the time? I remember reading once about an Inuit group from Alaska. They were having a race, okay? And the object of the race was for everybody to come in at the same time. That's how you knew it was a good race. And then there was an example from the Aboriginal peoples, and it was an American woman who was with them on a walkabout. That's a whole different story, but one evening they said to her, "We've taught you a lot of our games, etc. What can you teach us?" And she thought, oh my gosh, I don't have a ball, I don't have any board games. So she thought she'd teach them how to have a race. So she lines them up at this side over here, and she says, now, we're going to run over to that side, and the one who gets there first wins. Now, this is all being translated into the indigenous language. So the translator comes back, and he repeats what she has said. He says, okay, they're supposed to line up over there and run to over there, and someone's going to win. And she said, yes. And he said, they want to know what fun that is. Such a totally different mindset. Such a totally different mindset. And so those are some of the sacred cows we've got to look at. Is capitalism all bad? No, it does provide entrepreneurship and initiative. It does encourage that. all competition isn't bad, but we've kind of overdone it on that. There's an author who identifies 10 American values that he has kind of extracted from all of he works with exchange students. So they have identified these as American values. And we wouldn't like some of them, but it's what others see in us. And so we just have to look at them and say, is that worth holding on to? Or is there a better way to do it? Can we learn from someone else? We are so convinced that we're superior to the whole rest of the world. You know, and I remember, I think it was it Nixon or Reagan? I don't remember which one said, we're number one. That was his whole campaign thing. And I remember thinking at that time, why? What does it matter who's number one? You know, these are other human beings. And if there's one thing I learned at the UN, it was to work with people from multiple countries who love their country as much as I love mine. You know, and when we could sit down and talk about that, I learned so much from them. And hopefully they learned something from me. Any other questions? And I'm not sure I answered that, Rachel. But... Okay.
I have 2 questions from
Oh,
the online
Oh,
group.
okay.
One is a practical one, and then another is more aspirational. So, with COP27 going on, do you think it will go anywhere, especially on the US side?
Well, I will say that the people we have there, John Kerry, Al Gore, Biden, yes, I think they want it to go somewhere. The problem is when we get home and have to ratify something in Congress is where the difficulty is. And I can't answer for that. Who knows what's going to happen with this Congress now? I'm not sure at all. But I think the intention is there. And I think people need to know that in that bill that got passed, you know, that $1 billion bill, there is $370 billion in Biden's bill for climate change.
The IRA.
The IRA, yeah. And there are $200,000 grants available to NGOs and parishes and congregations who want to make, like put in solar power, solar lighting, etc. And people need to know that.
Because we do.
Yes.
Then you started to answer the next one. What can we as a parish do what would be your top recommendations to get involved in?
Well, I think one thing you already are doing is, I know you're working in the neighborhood around the parish and doing some really, really good stuff there because you're listening to the people. I know because I've talked with a number of you who have worked with that. And I know Lori has shared several times with our Faith Communities Go Green initiative about, you know, forming a green team or healthy earth team, as I think you call it, in your parish, and how important that is. And so I think, you know, tapping into some of the groups who are already doing something. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. You know, what's happening in your neighborhood? I remember many, many years ago, when Mother Teresa was still very active, a young college student said to her, you know, how can you stand every day to look at all the poverty and the misery and the suffering that you see? How do you know where to begin? And her answer was very simple. She said, sorry, she said, start with what's right in front of you. And that's all any of us can do. What's happening in your neighborhoods? Can you get together with some other people in the neighborhoods? Green Umbrella is trying to find spaces in different neighborhoods to start the Common Orchard Project. They'll come in and put an orchard there. You know, and the city has given them a number of different places. So if you see land that's not being used in your neighborhood, you know, contact Green Umbrella. And they may be able to do the Common Orchard Project there. You know, what are the other things that need to be done? Are you all aware of the Cincinnati Reuse and Recycle Hub? Okay, because they're recycling a ton of stuff that nobody else is recycling. You know, so even to volunteer down there once in a while, they can always use help. Okay, but they are doing a phenomenal job. They have saved 2 tons of garbage from landfills in the last 2 years. Okay, and it's stuff that we would throw out anyway. But they're finding a way to recycle a lot of that.
What are they called, Cincinnati?
Cincinnati Reuse and Recycle Hub. It's located down on Evans Street. Yes?
You know, in terms of the grants that you're talking about with this new legislation, the Cincinnati Zoo here has done tremendous things.
Yes.
They are neutral in terms of energy now with the solar panels that are above their parking lot.
Right.
Xavier University has all this parking lot that, you know, we could get a grant from this bill
Yes.
to at least start
Mhm.
progressively having solar panels over those parking lots and be able to generate electricity that would make the university neutral in terms of carbon.
There you go. There's an initiative you can start on right
I think we really
away.
ought to pressure the university
Mhm.
and the Jesuit community. Loyola University is a model for this kind of
Mhm.
experiment. And I think that it's really something that we could do as a parish,
Yeah.
as part of a community.
And that money is out there now.
Exactly.
Waiting for
With-
people
with
to
this
use it.
legislation
Yeah.
we're talking about.
My community, just 2 weeks ago, we dedicated a brand new ministry center on our property that's 100% net zero. It's all geothermal and solar. You know, so.
Paula Gonzalez, or whatever Paula said this year. You're
Right,
guiding the way
actually,
there.
the ministry center is on the property, right on the spot where her house used to be. They wanted to try to incorporate that into the new building, but it just wasn't possible. So they named it the La Casa del Sol Ministry Center in her honor.
I'm going to be one of the reporters on TV. In 30 seconds, 45 seconds, are you hopeful?
Yeah, I think I have to be hopeful, okay? And because I've seen so many people throughout the world, I'm up to 48 countries now, trying to make it to 50. But I've seen so many people throughout the world that are making such a difference and that are really caring people. And the other thing, if you're really interested in some of the whole new cosmology idea, go to Deep Time Network. They offer some wonderful programs. I did a 9-month program with them last year, and there were 60 people in the program from 5 continents. And the program's long since over, but our pod is continuing to meet every month. So every month I'm meeting with people from China, Australia, New Zealand, from different places. And so just, it opens your mind to different realities. And you can do it right online.
On behalf of all of us who've experienced you, again, thank you.
You're very welcome. My pleasure.
So what's next? Our steering committee will be distributing an Advent calendar next week. We are also planning to hold 2 winter events, a screening of Pope Francis's new documentary, The Letter, on January 10th, and a Taizé prayer service on January 19th. More details will be shared from Tim on the email list. Our presentations and immersions will resume again in February, resulting or culminating in an Earth Day retreat on April 22nd at the Jesuit Spiritual Center in Milford. But I was asked to also mention, if you did not complete the pre-assessment yet, please do so soon. There is a QR code on your reflection sheet that directly links you to the assessment, and it was emailed to all who RSVP'd. Thanks again for all of you who have come out tonight, braved the Cincinnati winter, and there are some refreshments in the back, and thank all of you who have tuned in live stream. Good night.